Lauren Mitchell was the kind of professional people rarely noticed until something broke. 42, with nearly 2 decades of experience, she was the quiet force that kept a SaaS company in Austin running. She managed every server update, every cloud contract, every network safeguard, even the automated coffee machine that signaled the start of the workday. For 18 years, Lauren carried the company on her shoulders without seeking recognition, building systems so seamless that most employees never realized how much of their work depended on her. Then came the meeting. HR called her in without warning, delivered a polished speech about how her role no longer aligns with the company's agile vision, and slid across the termination papers. To them, she was just another name to cut in a wave of restructuring, someone they believed could be replaced by a fresher face and a shiny new platform. Lauren left with quiet composure. But what they didn't realize was that she still carried 2 invisible keys: administrative access to the backbone of their systems, and the legal power tied to a long-forgotten office lease, one that still bore her signature. Within days, the company would face the unimaginable, locked out of their own systems and their own building. When Lauren first joined the company, it was little more than an ambitious idea operating out of a shared co-working space. There were 7 employees, 2 folding tables, and a constant hum of uncertainty in the air. The founders were visionaries, but their vision didn't extend to understanding what it would take to actually keep a business running on a technical level. Lauren stepped in and, without fanfare, began building the foundation they didn't even know they needed. When the company couldn't secure the credit to buy its first server, Lauren paid for it out of her own pocket, trusting that the investment would one day pay off. Not just for the business but for everyone building it from the ground up. She quietly negotiated contracts with AWS long before cloud strategy was a buzzword, set up secure VPN access before remote work became a necessity, and personally managed every domain, email system, and authentication protocol. Her reach extended beyond the digital. She was the one who secured their first official office space, reading the fine print on the lease and ensuring it wouldn't crush the company financially. She arranged security keycards, oversaw the installation of the network backbone, and even made sure the coffee machine was reliable enough to survive back-to-back product launches. Over the years, the company grew from that small shared space to a sprawling downtown office with hundreds of employees. Yet Lauren's role never appeared on a press release, never got mentioned at company town halls. To most of her colleagues, she was simply the answer to every technical inconvenience. Internet slow? Lauren will fix it. Email down? Lauren will fix it. Server acting up in the middle of the night? Lauren will fix it. She became the invisible backbone, the silent constant in a company addicted to chasing the next big thing. And as the years passed, she realized a quiet truth about her field. The better you are at preventing problems, the less anyone notices you at all. In tech, the quieter your work is, the more invisible your value becomes. It was a reality she accepted, until the day the company decided it could live without her. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a hairline crack in a foundation that no one bothers to fix. The CEO, eager to impress investors with a bold new phase of growth, brought in a young COO named Sophie Park. 29, armed with a Harvard MBA and a vocabulary heavy with phrases like scaling for disruption and breaking legacy bottlenecks, Sophie embodied the kind of restless ambition that boards a door. She didn't just want to lead, she wanted to leave her fingerprint on every corner of the organization fast. In her first weeks, Sophie zeroed in on the IT department, or rather the lack of a department. To her, Lauren wasn't a department head. She was a single point of control, a gatekeeper to systems Sophie didn't fully understand. She saw a risk where the CEO had long seen reliability. In Sophie's eyes, consolidating so much infrastructure knowledge into one person's hands was inefficient, even dangerous. She framed it as a need for fresh energy, and soon a proposal circulated among the leadership team: outsource infrastructure management to a cheaper offshore vendor that promised round-the-clock coverage for a fraction of the cost. Plan was approved in under 2 weeks. There were no deep technical evaluations, no long-term risk assessments, just the allure of cost savings and the thrill of modernizing a critical function without the messiness of actually learning how it worked. Lauren was called into HR on a gray Thursday afternoon. conversation was brief, dressed in polite corporate language. Her role, they explained, no longer aligned with the company's agile vision. She would receive 8 weeks of severance, a pat on the back, and the expectation that she'd quietly step aside for the incoming vendor. She handed over her keycards and her company-issued laptop, both meticulously wiped and organized. But there were things she didn't hand over, things no one asked about. She still retained the highest-level administrative access to the company's servers and cloud platforms, something that couldn't simply be transferred without deliberate coordination. More importantly, she still held the lease for the downtown office space in her own name, a relic from the early days when the company couldn't pass a basic credit check and she'd volunteered to sign on their behalf. Walking out of the building, Lauren carried nothing but a slim folder of personal documents and a calm, unshakable awareness. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't even planned. It was simply the truth. If the people running the company didn't know who controlled their infrastructure or even their physical office, they weren't ready to run it at all. That thought, sharp and quiet, stayed with her long after the glass doors closed behind her. 3 days after Lauren's departure, the first cracks became impossible to ignore. On a Monday morning, the company's email system went dark. Messages bounced, inboxes froze, and automated workflows stalled. The offshore vendor scrambled to diagnose the issue, only to discover it wasn't a technical glitch at all. The AWS account that hosted critical services had failed its billing cycle. Payment method on file was Lauren's personal corporate card, the same one she had set up years ago when the company didn't have the credit history to secure enterprise services on its own. Without her authorization, the charges couldn't clear. While leadership debated in a panicked group chat, a second crisis unfolded. The building's keycard system, quietly dependent on a small, locally hosted server, went offline. Employees arriving for work swiped their badges against the reader and got nothing but a dull red light. It wasn't a hardware failure. The keycard server had also lost access to its cloud integration, another casualty of the suspended AWS account. By mid-morning, the situation turned from inconvenient to untenable. The office lease, which Sophie and the CEO had assumed was under the company's control, was still in Lauren's name. It had never been transferred because for 18 years no one thought it necessary. The lease was structured month to month, a flexibility that had once been a lifeline, but now gave Lauren the power to end it without fanfare. That morning, she submitted a formal termination notice to the building's management. The request was processed immediately. By early afternoon, maintenance staff were on site changing the locks. There was no drama, no raised voices, just the mechanical click of deadbolts being replaced and new access codes entered into the system. When Sophie and the CEO returned from an emergency investor call, they found themselves standing on the sidewalk, staring at the locked glass doors of their own headquarters. Inside, desks sat empty and silent. Outside, employees clustered in the cafe across the street, laptops unopened, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. Conversations buzzed over paper coffee cups, a mix of speculation, frustration, and a dawning awareness that the infrastructure they had taken for granted was far more fragile than anyone had admitted. For Lauren, watching the scene from a distance, there was no satisfaction in the chaos, only confirmation of a truth she had learned long ago. When the foundation is invisible, no one notices it until it's gone. And when it's gone, there is no quick way to replace it. By the 4th day, desperation began to seep through the company's polished facade. The CEO, usually measured and composed, placed a direct call to Lauren. His tone carried the weight of urgency he could no longer disguise. He offered her double her previous salary, an open contract, and the promise of full autonomy if she would just come back and stabilize the systems. Call was followed hours later by an email from Sophie. The subject line was short and almost humble. "We underestimated your operational scope." Lauren read both messages in silence. She knew these weren't real offers of respect. They were emergency lifelines thrown by leaders who had dismissed her as unnecessary only a week earlier. She replied to neither right away, but her decision was already firm. She was not in the business of cleaning up messes that had been entirely preventable, messes that existed because people had ignored her expertise when it mattered. While leadership scrambled to coax her back, the chaos inside the company deepened. The building's service contracts, everything from after-hours security to routine cleaning, were tied to billing systems Lauren had managed personally. Without payment processing or authorized signatories, those services were suspended. Security staff stopped showing up for night shifts. Trash bins overflowed. Conference rooms went uncleaned, creating a visible decline in the once impressive office environment. But the more damaging blow came from outside. Companies' largest enterprise clients, the ones whose annual contracts represented the bulk of recurring revenue, could no longer access their dashboards. Critical data streams were frozen behind failed authentication systems that no one on the current IT team understood well enough to repair. These dashboards weren't just reporting tools, they were operational lifelines for the client's own businesses. Within 48 hours of the outage, 3 of the top 5 enterprise clients sent formal termination notices, citing breach of service-level agreements. Others began withholding payments until access was restored. Investor calls grew tense. Sophie, once eager to disrupt old structures, now avoided eye contact during virtual meetings, her polished optimism replaced with clipped, defensive updates. The CEO's confident tone had eroded into carefully measured reassurances that convinced no one. Employees whispered about delayed paychecks and rumors of an incoming mass layoff. From her own home office, Lauren watched the ripple effects unfold through industry chatter and secondhand updates from former colleagues. She felt no triumph in their collapse, only a quiet certainty that the warning signs had been there all along, ignored in the rush to appear modern and agile. What they were experiencing now wasn't bad luck. It was the direct cost of dismantling the backbone without understanding what it supported. And that cost, she knew, was only beginning to tally. By the time the final pieces of the company's collapse became public, Lauren had already moved on. An established cybersecurity firm in Denver reached out through a mutual industry contact, offering her a role as head of infrastructure security. The offer came with a salary 45% higher than what she had earned before, full remote flexibility, and a team that valued her operational insight from day one. She accepted without hesitation, not out of spite but because it was a natural progression, a place where her quiet expertise would be understood as the backbone it truly was. Meanwhile, her former company unraveled in plain view. Without a functioning office lease, they were forced to scatter teams into temporary co-working spaces. The unified culture they once boasted about fractured as employees left for more stable roles elsewhere. Projects stalled, deadlines slipped, and entire client accounts evaporated. Sophie, whose arrival had been announced with glossy press releases and talk of innovation, was quietly transitioned into a vague role labeled as a special project, which in practice meant being removed from daily operations. From a distance, Lauren reflected on the entire sequence with clarity. The biggest lesson was simple, though rarely spoken aloud in corporate boardrooms: operational knowledge is leverage. It doesn't announce itself in presentations or earn applause at company all-hands meetings. But it holds everything together, every contract, every system, every dependency that leaders often forget exists until it fails. She also understood that silent expertise is the lifeblood of stability. Quieter the role, the more it's taken for granted, and the easier it is for decision-makers to believe it can be replaced by cheaper labor or flashier leadership. Until, of course, the silence turns into outage reports, client complaints, and revenue loss. And perhaps the most personal takeaway, leaving can speak louder than staying. Walking away without fanfare or visible retaliation had allowed gravity to take over. Systems she had once sustained simply followed the natural laws of neglect. People who had dismissed her value learned the lesson not through her words but through their own consequences. Lauren never once considered revenge. She didn't need to. In the digital world, as in the physical one, when you hold the keys, whether they're server root credentials or the name on a lease, power is not about using them recklessly. It's about knowing their weight and choosing when to set them down. And as she settled into her new role, surrounded by a team that respected her foresight and precision, she knew she hadn't just left a job. She had left an entire chapter behind, with the final sentence written not by her, but by the immutable pull of cause and effect.